Right. Well, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Ag in the Evening program. So tonight's topic is going to be common feed ingredients and kind of really understanding some of the differences and how we can go about best utilizing them and where they fit and which ones may not fit for you. And so one of the big things when we look at different feed ingredients, we want to compare the nutritional value of those feeds. And the big thing we're going to look at most of the time is going to be TDN. And remember, TDN stands for total digestible nutrients. That's a measure of energy. If we were talking about people, we'd be talking about calories, and then crude protein will be something else we'll look at as well. And then there's some other things as you get a little more advanced, you'll look at as well. But TDN is going to be the big one. And when it comes to TDN, it's important to realize that there's some ways that work well to calculate TDN, and then unfortunately, there's some other ways that don't do a very good job of estimating TDN. So just quickly, the way I prefer to calculate TDN is using what we call a summative equation, where we take the different analytical components that we measure, such as crude protein, NDF, starch, water-soluble carbohydrates, and fatty acids, and then we either measure digestibility for those for the given feed, or in some situations, we're going to use book values, or we may have to use some research values, especially if we're looking at some processing and things. But we can apply that digestibility coefficient to each one of those fractions and then use that to calculate that TDN. Now, the last one there on the bottom, RDM, just stands for remaining dry matter. And that's not something we actually measure. What that's going to be is when we account for all the other analytical fractions, there's going to be some portion remaining that, based on the test we have right now, we're not going to account for. And so that's going to be the difference there. And then we'll assign a general digestibility to that. Most situations, that's not going to have a huge impact on TDN. The two things that have the biggest impact on TDN typically are going to be NDF here, and that can range tremendously in digestibility. And so we want to use an in vitro assay to estimate that. And when we go to a reputable lab, we can get that done. And then, especially when we're dealing with certain feeds that are high in starch, digestibility of starch will come into play. And really, that's going to have to do with processing of those feeds to some extent. And we'll look at that in more detail here in a minute. The other thing to realize is sometimes we see lower performance than you would expect based on the TDN of a feed. And that's because we may see increased acidosis because we've overprocessed that feed. And so it ferments too quickly in the rumen and it drops that pH too much. And so that animal doesn't perform as well as we would expect, or we're not feeding correctly. And correctly may not be the best term, but when we're talking about most of our feeds, we really need to feed those daily. If we're feeding every other day or less frequently than that, we're going to cause issues with subacute acidosis, a little bit of acidosis, and we just don't get the same benefit out of that feed. Plus, it can lead to other problems as well. The other thing is because of some rumen function and that pH as well, is sometimes even though you may think or would expect there's going to be a difference, we may not see a difference. And one of those situations is when we're talking about feeding cattle in a feedlot and feeding them whole shell corn versus rolled corn. And a lot of times we actually don't see any difference in that situation. Another place where that comes into play is when we're feeding cattle on a feedlot, when we do add some distiller's grains in there, even though that distiller's grains is slightly lower in TDN than corn because of some other things that are going on in the rumen, we may actually see performance of those cattle increase a little bit. So I say that all that to most of the time we're going to be evaluating the TDN value of those feeds, but sometimes we may lean more favorably to one or another because of historically what we know happens in the rumen and what that means from an animal performance standpoint. The other thing that it's going to come up, and you'll see this a little bit throughout the presentation tonight, and especially as we're talking about the feed industry overall, is the term hull is not always used uniformly to represent the same portions of the plant when we talk about cereal grains, oil seeds, and other associated products. So there's some times when we'll use the word hull that's actually a really good feed stuff. But in a lot of situations, if you see the word hull, that's probably not going to be a very good feed stuff and something we're not going to use. And that's because the digestibility of that whole fraction is really low. And especially on certain cereal grains, it can inhibit the digestion of the starch portion as well, making less of that energy available to the animal. So I kind of broke tonight's presentation up into two groups. So we're going to start with what I would describe as the grains, or sometimes people will use the term cereal grains. And what we're talking about there is corn, sorghum, rice. Those are all warm season crops. And then wheat, oats, and barley would be cool season crops. And then there are several others, but these are going to be kind of the core ones. Now, we're not really going to get into rice in detail tonight, but if you do have some questions on that, I'll be happy to answer those. And again, on sorghum, while we do see a little sorghum fed, it's not something that most cow-calf producers or stocker operators are going to have access to. So I thought it would be kind of interesting just to look at these different grains and what kind of the global production of them is. And so these are some global estimates from 2023, 24 year, and corn's the highest by a pretty good margin, followed by wheat, rice, barley, sorghum, and oats there in the graph here, and then rye even lower. I don't have rye on the list because we just don't ever feed that to livestock here in the US. Just kind of reference, and I'll show you some oilseed data later. But if you look at the global production of corn for that time period compared to the global production of soybeans, you can see we produce a tremendous amount more corn than we do soybeans. But even with that being said, not soybeans, but soybean meal will be the number two feed ingredient we use from a livestock standpoint. Corn's going to be our number one feed ingredient. When we think about the whole again, it's important to realize that depending on what grain we're talking about, those get harvested and handled a little bit differently. So when we talk about things like corn, sorghum, wheat, or rye, when those are harvested, what I would refer to as the hull is actually left in the field. So it's going to come out the back end of the combine and it's going to get left in the field, and it doesn't come along with the grain. Now, when we're talking about oats, barley, and especially rice, that hull comes along with the grain. And sometimes it's separated out later and sometimes it's not. And you'll see some of the implications of that here later. Um, and then we can break that down even a little bit further. When we think about oats, the hull, so the very outer portion, and then the kernel, that's going to be what most people think as the grain portion. They're not fused together, so they'll come apart a little bit easier. In contrast, when we talk about barley and rice, they are fused together with most varieties. There's some breeding that's going on with some of the barley where we can get into what are referred to as hulless types, and they're not truly hulless. It's just that the hull is loosely attached, so it will fall off during harvesting, more similar to what we see with corn and wheat and sorghum in that situation. So those are some things that when we look at the feeding value, we have to be aware of and understand. So when we think about corn, you'll see different processing methods used for corn. And so when I talk about whole shelled corn, what I'm talking about is the picture here on the top left, or what some people will refer to as deer corn. And in most situations, that's what we're going to want to feed when we're talking about cow-calf and stocker operators. And I'll get into a little more details of why that is in a minute. And then you'll hear people talk about cracked or rolled corn. And so that's what we're looking at in the top left. And those two terms, cracked and rolled, get used interchangeably. And then the bottom left here would be steam flake corn, and then the bottom right would be ground corn. From a rumen acidosis and a risk and safety standpoint, whole corn is going to be the safest. Cracked corn would come next, steam flake corn would come after that, ground corn would come last. But whole corn is what we're going to want to use in most situations. As I mentioned earlier, corn is the number one feed ingredient used in the livestock industry in the United States. When we think about whole corn compared to cracked or steamed corn or steam flake corn, it's going to be more cost effective. And so when you look at the energy value and you look at the cost, that whole corn is actually cheaper per unit of TDN for cow-calf producers and stocker producers than what that cracked corn is, and especially what that steam flake corn is. And some people say, well, why do they steam flake corn in the feedlots? Well, it's a little different situation. In the feedlots, they have their own flaker there, so they can flake that and immediately feed it to cattle. And so the economics are a little bit different. The other thing is they don't have to worry about drying it and treating it so it doesn't mold. So if you're trying to buy steam flake corn, it's wet coming out of that flaker. You then have to, if it's not in a feedlot situation, dry that corn back down, which is an added cost. And then typically it's treated with propionic acid, which is another added cost to help keep it from molding. And so that's one of the reasons that the pricing situation is different for a feedlot versus somebody who's trying to buy that to use in a cow-calf or stocker operation. The other thing I would tell you is why we see a lot of steam flake corn in the Texas and the Oklahoma panhandle. When we get into Nebraska and the Midwest, typically they're not running steam flake corn, they're running cracked corn in those situations. As I mentioned earlier, whole corn is going to be much safer than cracked or flake corn from an acidosis standpoint. You will see a little bit of that corn in the manure. Don't worry about that. That's going to be accounted for when we look at the TDN values here on the next slide. The other thing I would tell you why you can't readily see it, there is some of that cracked corn and some of that flake corn that ends up in the manure as well. It's just the whole kernel corn is a little bit easier to see. In most situations, what we know is the rumen microbes actually get through the seed coat on that whole kernel corn and they eat the inside out. Now, you will get some kernels that pass all the way through intact, but again, we have that figured into the TDN value. One of the byproducts we see from the corn industry is something called corn gluten feed. And specifically, if you've heard the term high fructose corn syrup that we use in a lot of sweeteners, especially in beverages, the byproduct from the production of that high fructose corn syrup, and so they're making that from corn grain, is what we call corn gluten feed. It's actually a really good source of both protein and energy, and we use it in a lot of different feeds. Another corn byproduct would be what we would call distiller's grains, and you'll see that abbreviated DDG for dry distiller's grains or DDGS for dry distiller's grains plus solubles. That's the byproduct of the ethanol industry when we're making ethanol to use in vehicles to replace some of the gasoline. Most of that's going to be straight corn, but sometimes we do see some sorghum distiller's grains there. Not a huge worry whether it's corn or sorghum, but most of the time it is going to be corn. One of the nice things about distiller's grains is it gives us a valuable source of what we call rumen undegradable protein. And a lot of times in a cattle diet, we'll have plenty of rumen degradable protein, but we may need some rumen undegradable protein, and that is one nice feature of distiller's grains. So I'll go ahead and set this slide up because you'll see the same layout on several more as we go. And so I'll have the feed ingredient on the left-hand side here, and then the percent TDN. So remember, that's our energy value. The higher the number, the better there. Percent crude protein. RDP just stands for rumen degradable protein. And so I mentioned rumen undegradable protein on the other slide. Rumen degradable protein plus rumen undegradable protein has to equal 100. So if it's high in RDP, you know it's going to be lower in RUP. Not something to get hung up on, but as a nutritionist, that is something I pay attention to. Percent NDF, percent starch, and then percent fatty acids. And I use the term fatty acids and not fat because fatty acids is a more accurate measurement and we can do a better job of assigning energy values of feeds. The other thing is you'll see sometimes I don't have any values in the boxes, and that's because it's going to be the exact same value as so whole corn, cracked corn, flake corn are all going to have the same crude protein value. The only thing that's going to change there is the TDN or the total digestible nutrients. So that's why you're going to see those dots. It's just to make it clear that they would be the same as the whole corn. So when we look at whole corn, just under 91% TDN, cracked corn slightly higher at 92, but when you look at the cost of cracking it, that typically is not going to pay for most cow, calf, and stocker producers, and especially when we figure the safety back in there. And then the steam flake corn, it's a little bit higher as well, but again, you're only talking about 4.3 points of TDN there. And when we start looking at the economics and the rumen pH situation, whole corn works way better for us. Um, Corn is an energy source, as we can see from a really high TDN value here. That's going to be one of the highest levels of TDN you're going to see tonight. It's not a great source of protein. It's low in protein here. And you can see most of that energy is actually coming from starch. So 70, a little over 70% starch on average. If we look at corn gluten feed, where they've taken a lot of that starch and they convert it to glucose, and then they actually convert that glucose back over to fructose to get high fructose corn syrup, we'll end up with a feed that generally is about 81.5% TDN, which is a really good value, 23% protein. It's most of that protein is digestible in the rumen. A little bit of NDF there, about 36%. There is some starch left that comes through that process, so they don't take all the starch out. And then a little bit of fat as well. Um, and then when we look at dry distillers grains, you'll hear people talk about high fat and low fat, and sometimes it's hard to know what you're getting. And it's not something to really worry about because if you look at, there's not a big difference in TDN here. And when we look at variation from ethanol plant to ethanol plant, we see more variation than that just from plant to plant because of different processes that they have. So I don't get real hung up whether you're dealing with high fat or low fat distillers grains unless we're putting a whole lot in the diet and then I worry about getting too much fat. But that's typically not going to be a situation for most producers. If we look at protein, you can see 30.2% protein and 31% protein here. So of all the corn or corn byproducts we talked about, by far the highest protein levels, the lowest RDP levels. That's what I was talking about. It has a little more rumen undegradable protein, have some fiber, but that fiber or that NDF is pretty digestible. And NDF is totally different than crude fiber, so don't get those mixed up. Um, Percent starch, you can see there's a little starch left, and then fat. Don't everybody wants to get hung up on fat numbers. I'll tell you, I don't ever look at fat numbers. I'm looking at TDN numbers unless I'm worried about getting too much fat in the diet. So TDN is what you want to use to compare. But really good TDN values there. You can see our distillers grains is not much different than corn when we're talking about TDN values, a little bit lower, but not that much lower. And so that's one of the reasons we use a lot of distillers grains and feedlot diets these days, but it also is a really good supplement for cows as well because it has so much protein. If we're short on protein, we can give those cows a high energy feed and a fairly high protein feed at the same time. So all good options there. Again, we'd use whole corn, skipped, cracked, and flaked. But for feeding cows, corn gluten feed's a good option. Distillers grains is a good option. Now, one thing to be aware of with corn is depending on the mycotoxin levels, is corn is restricted on how and where it can be sold. And so if it's going into the dairy industry, it has to have a certain level of mycotoxins. It can't be above a certain level. If it's going to cow-calf operations, it can't be above a certain level. If it's going to feedlots, it can be a little bit higher. If it is going to wildlife, it can be even higher, unfortunately. It's not ideal for the wildlife, but that's the way the regulations work. So be aware of that. So if you are buying corn, pay attention to that because there is some wildlife corn that will have this higher level of mycotoxins in there that would not be appropriate for feeding cattle, depending on what cattle you were feeding. The other thing is, even if you were within FDA requirements on mycotoxins, typically we see lower quality corn. And so the protein and the energy levels will be a little less. So just pay attention to that. The other thing is, even if it doesn't have any mycotoxins in there, If they put the picture of the deer on the bag, typically you're paying a little extra for it in that situation. So just things to be aware of there. Now, with distillers grains, I talked about distillers grains being a byproduct from the ethanol industry, and that's the way it should be referred to. But unfortunately, distillers grains is getting used in a lot of situations where it shouldn't these days. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So whether we call it DDG, whether we call it DDGS, or whether you actually call it dry distillers grains plus solubles, that is the co-product from the ethanol industry. We have seen a lot of increase in availability the last 5 to 10 years here, where there are a few feed dealers who are actually selling it in 50-pound bags, a lot more that are selling it in totes or super sacks. And then you can get truckloads very easy. That used to be the only way you could get it, which is truckloads. The other thing is typically distillers grains is sold loose. So kind of think of something similar to cornmeal, but maybe even smaller particle size. That's the way it's typically sold. But there are a few places that are cubing it and pelling it, making pellets out of it as well. So we are seeing that in some situations. Um, then there's what I would refer to as distillers spent grains. All right. And this is byproduct of cereal grains coming from the distilling process in the production of liquor for human consumption. And that's primarily going to be from corn, it could be wheat or rice as well. This is coming from very large commercial producers. These are going to be in truckload lots, so we're talking 48 to 50,000 pounds. Sometimes it gets referred to as distillers grains. It really shouldn't. It's not going to be a feedstuff for most producers because of the water content and how quickly you need to feed it, but it does work really well in feedlot and dairy rations at times. Same thing when we talk about brewer's grains or spent grain, excuse me. This is going to be a byproduct of cereal grains for beer and malt production. It's primarily going to come from barley and wheat, and again from large beer producers, truckload lots typically. Again, good feed source, higher in water content, typically limited to dairies and feedlots. The one that's created a lot of confusion the last several years is what I would refer to as spent grains from craft beer and liquor production. And a lot of people call these distillers grains, and they're nothing like the distillers grains from an ethanol plant. They're going to be extremely high in water content. I'm talking often in excess of 90%, highly, highly variable, limited quantities. Generally, they're just not worth the hassle. When you start figuring out how much actual feed you have there, how much water you have, how infrequently you're going to get it, and it needs to be fed daily if you're going to try to use something like this, it's just not worth the hassle. So that's something to be aware of, even when it's free. It's not, most people realize after they mess with it for a few weeks that it's not worth the hassle. So just be aware of that and make sure if somebody's talking DDGs, exactly what they're talking about. Is it coming from ethanol production or is it coming from craft beer and liquor production? So that kind of covers corn and some of the corn byproducts. I wanted to talk about wheat, oats, and barley just a little bit. When we think about wheat, it does have a higher risk of acidosis, especially compared to corn. We do see a little more benefit from a processing compared to corn, and you'll see that on an upcoming slide. It's typically not routinely fed because wheat has more value going into the human food supply chain to make bread and pasta and other dishes like that. However, there are years when we have an excess wheat supply where it gets really cheap that we will see it used in the feedlot industry at times, but we have to be kind of careful feeding it. Generally not something worth the hassle for cow-calf or stocker producers. Barley is not something we see as much in this part of the world, but if you do have kids or grandkids that are feeding show cattle, you may hear somebody talk about barley. You don't need to mess with barley, just feed corn. Um, we see barley grown more in the northern United States and especially in Canada. The rate of the starch digestion is real fast compared to other cereal grains, and so that makes it a higher risk of acidosis. It does have to be processed, and you'll see what happens to TDN if we don't process it. Like I said, it's just not very common in the southern United States, but some feed stores do carry barley in 50-pound sacks because people think they need it for show steers. You don't. Um, Oats is one that has a lower energy value. Generally, it's not going to be cost effective for cattle because of the limited supply of oats. And most of the oats that are getting used from a livestock feed are going to go into the horse industry and not the cattle industry. And you'll see that lower energy value coming up. What we do see used quite a bit is a byproduct from the flour production industry, and it's often referred to as wheat midds. There's a couple other names out there, but wheat midds is going to be the most common. So when we process wheat for flour, 70 to 75% of that wheat generally becomes flour, and the remaining portions are going to go into this wheat mid product. It is going to be a little lower in energy value. It has a fair bit of NDF in it, but it's one of those situations where the NDF is not very digestible. And so that's where that lower energy value comes from. Wheat midds are often going to be one of the ingredients that are included in pellets, cubes, and other textured feeds. Typically don't have an opportunity to buy them just straight wheat midds because they're going into those other products as well. There is a little higher risk of acidosis. So when we look at the nutritional composition of some of these cereal grains, um, the way I have this set up is the first is going to be the whole grain, so unprocessed, and then a rolled version, and what that does with TDN. And remember, it's not going to change the protein, the fiber, and those things. So that's why we have dots here. So if you look at wheat grain, about 13.5% protein. So of the grains, it's typically going to be the highest in protein content, about 12.5% NDF. So that's a fair bit higher than what we see with corn. About 63% starch, which is lower than what we see with corn. If you look at whole wheat, about 67% TDN. If we roll that wheat, we can bump it up to about 88. So by processing that wheat, we make the starch and some of the other analytical components a little more digestible. And so there is a real benefit of processing wheat compared to not as much benefit when we were talking about corn earlier. Now, when we do process that wheat, that increases that risk of acidosis even more. So you do have to be mindful of that. And so that's why we typically limit that to a feedlot situation. When we look at whole barley, 59.9% TDN, that is not very good at all. A good pasture will be above that from a TDN standpoint. Um, you can see when we process that barley, we increase it tremendously. And that goes back to, remember, I talked about that hull, and with barley, that hull being attached and in most cases fused to the kernel portion. And so if we process it, we can break that hull up and allow those rumen microbes to get to the starch in the other portion of that barley kernel. Again, a little higher in NDF, and that's because we do have that hull attached, a little bit lower in starch, and then not a whole lot of fatty acids there. When we look at oats, so whole oats about 71.5%, rolled oats about 77.5% TDN. So that was what I was talking about. When we look at the price of oats per ton, they're going to be more expensive than corn. When we look at the energy value, corn's going to give us a whole lot more energy than we do oats. So it just doesn't make sense to use oats in most cattle diets. You may be saying, well, why do I see them in show feeds? Well, that's because people think they have to have them in a show feed. I've built several show feeds for kids and county agents, and I don't ever use oats in them because they don't make sense from a pricing standpoint when we look at the price per unit of energy and the price per unit of protein. You can see protein contents kind of in between wheat and barley there. Most of that protein is digested in the rumen, higher NDF content, and then oats do have a little higher fat content than our other cereal grains. They're going to have the highest fat content we see. But you can see still have a fairly low TDN there. When we look at wheat midds, I told you they weren't as high in TDN, so you can see about 69% here. do provide some protein at 19%. Most of that protein is degradable in the rumen. Much higher level of NDF, and that's because we take the wheat grain, we take most of that starch and make flour out of it, so we're concentrating some of those other portions. And one of the portions we really concentrate quite a bit is this NDF portion. You can see wheat midds still have some starch left in them. That's one of the reasons they're really high risk from an acidosis standpoint, and you do have to be a little more careful with them. So that's what I wanted to cover with the grains. I'll go ahead and pause for a second. If you have a question, this would be a good time to go ahead and ask that. Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat box. Okay, question did come in. Well, what about corn stalks? And so corn stalks would be in a different category, and so that's why I didn't include them here, but we can go ahead and talk about them. So when we look at corn stalks, that's not something we would typically feed in most winters. Most winters, we're going to be better off with Bermuda grass hay, Bahia grass hay, sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, Johnson grass, something like that. However, if we're in a drought situation, corn stalks can be a really good option for us. And in a drought situation, I would actually prefer corn stalks over sorghum stubble. The corn stalks will generally be a little bit higher in energy content than the sorghum stubble. Now, one huge key with corn stalks is it's going to depend on how they were baled, and specifically if the field was raked or not. And so with corn stalks, we can see that TDN go anywhere from 30 to about 60% TDN on corn stalks, which is a huge range. And you say, well, why is there so much variation? It has to do with soil contamination. Um, so if they go in there and harvest that corn for grain and they take the spreader off the back of the combine and what's coming through the combine, they create a windrow with that and they just go in there and bale that windrow, that ash or that dirt content is going to be pretty low. Those are going to be some pretty good corn stalks. That's what I would want to buy in a drought situation. If they go in there and they cut all the stalks, plus they have the stuff coming out of the combine, and they go in there and they moderately rake it. So they're raking and they're getting most, but they're leaving some of those stalks in the field. Then instead of that typical about 8% ash content, we're probably going to see 15, so let's just call it 13 to 16% ash content. And in that situation, a lot of times we'll see that TDN and that 45 to 48 range. So not great, but not horrible. If they go in there and rake that field, so they try to get every stalk and every leaf left, I've seen corn stalks where they're as high as 30% ash. And what they're measuring in ash is we're measuring the mineral in the plant, but then we're also measuring soil contamination. So what that tells us is there's a lot of soil that's in that bale of corn stalks there. And in that situation, the TDN value is going to be really low. So corn stalks are typically going to be just from a drought year is when we want to use those. And then we really want to try to get them when they're just baling that windrow behind the combine and not going in there and cutting and raking the field. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, go ahead and chat back in and we can visit a little bit more. But that's where corn stalks would fit in. Okay, good deal. All right, well, I'm not seeing anybody else unmuting or any other questions in the chat box, so we'll go ahead and proceed to oil seeds. So we talked about our grains. Now we're going to talk about what we call oil seeds. So those would be things like soybeans, rape seeds. You won't see that term used in the US or Canada very much. We actually typically use the term canola, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Sunflower seed, cotton seed, peanuts. These are all I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. But then flaxseed is another one. Now with flaxseed, the meal they'll actually call linseed meal. But if we're talking about the whole seed, we call it flaxseed. Safflower seed would be another, and there would be some others as well. But again, I'm just going to focus on these top five here. So again, if we kind of look at our world production from that same period when we were looking at the grains, you can see way more soybeans produced than anything else in the world from a cereal grain standpoint. But soybeans, then rapeseed, then sunflower seed, then peanuts, and then cottonseed would actually be one of the lowest there. When we think about oil seeds, we could use that whole oil seed for energy supplement. And it can be a pretty good energy supplement. We don't see that done a whole lot, but we could if we needed to. What we typically see more often is the oil gets extracted to use in human food production or in certain industries, and then the remaining byproduct is typically used for our protein supplement. And so that's where we're getting that is we have the oil seed, we take the oil away, and then we have that protein byproduct remaining. And so starting off looking at soybeans, and so from a TDN standpoint, if you look at whole soybeans, slightly over 100, crude protein is going to be about 40, and they're going to be about almost 18% fatty acids there. So that's oil. A fatty acid is oil, what we're talking about there. And that's what those soybeans are typically grown for. If we look at soybean meal, it's still really high in TDN, 88 and a half. You can see that's similar to what we were talking about with the distillers grains earlier and just a little bit below the corn we were talking about. Crude protein on soybean meal is 52.6% there. Um, Soybean meal used to not price very well for us on the cattle side of things, but the last several years it has started to price in quite well and cheaper than cottonseed meal. And so I've used a lot of soybean meal for producers over the last several years, including in our family operation. And then soybean hulls. And so what soybean hulls are is I'll show you on the next slide here. The soybean itself, there's a little thin membrane on the outside, and that's actually where these soybean hulls come from. They'll be about 80% TDN, just under 12% protein. They're really high in NDF, but these are not a roughage source. This is a really fermentable source, really digestible source of NDF. So it doesn't provide any kind of roughage value at all. We've This is what we've fed the most of over the years is soybean hulls. Like I said, we're starting to feed more soybean meal. We typically won't feed any whole soybeans unless it's a crop that didn't produce very well, and so there's not a lot of value for them. Then we'll feed some whole soybeans at that time. When we think about whole soybeans in cattle, because cattle are ruminant, we don't have to worry about heat treating them like we would in a non-ruminant. So that's why we can feed what we call raw soybeans, so they haven't been heat treated. However, because of some phytoestrogens that are in those whole soybeans, we don't want to feed them to open females of breeding age. Those phytoestrogens can cause some cystic ovaries, which can cause some reductions in performance. If those females are bred, no problem. They work really well. That's actually what I did part of my PhD research on, was feeding oil seeds to cows. If we look at soybean meal, so I showed you on the previous slide, 52% protein, and here it says 49. That's because on the previous slide, I showed you on a dry matter basis, so there's no water in there. And that's the way, as a nutritionist, we always want to look at feeds, and that's the way I would suggest you compare feeds. It's always on a dry matter basis. But when you look at a feed tag, it's going to be on what we call an as fed basis. And so that's why that protein level is going to be a little bit lower there. And so that's why you see 49%. As I indicated earlier, soybean meal is the second most used livestock feed ingredient behind corn. Most of that is going into the swine market and the poultry market, but we are seeing more of it in the cattle side of things. And we actually may start seeing even more soybean meal available depending on what happens with sustainable aviation fuel. They were looking at using soybean oil to make sustainable aviation fuel. Soybean hulls are typically going to be sold as a pellet. We do see a lot of fines sometimes with soybean hulls. There is a risk of acidosis due to that rapid digestion of NDF I was talking about earlier. Um, there used to be a lower protein level of soybean meal. We hadn't seen that in years. But what they used to do was because there wasn't as good of a market for the soybean hulls, they would take some of the soybean hulls and mix them with the soybean meal and sell a lower protein content of soybean meal. But the soybean hulls have so much value these days, they just sell straight soybean meal and straight soybean hulls. So this is what I was talking about when we say the soybean hull. So this is the soybean, and you can see this outer little membrane here is cracked, all right? And then the inner part is the rest of the soybean, but this little outer part, that's what the soybean hulls are made of. So they're really light, really fluffy, and that's why they put them in a pellet to make them easier to transport and handle. Kind of interesting, some information from the American Soybean Association is actually when we look at the soybean, they're growing those soybeans and they're processing them for oil. But then when you look at the overall value, about 70% of the value of that soybean is actually getting attributed to the soybean meal portion. And about 97% of US soybean meal is going to go to livestock feed and poultry. Little bit of it will go for human consumption, but most of it's livestock feed and poultry feed. So when we talk about canola, if you've never seen canola before, this is what a canola field looks like. So really pretty crop out there. These are actually the canola seeds. So you can see the seed pod, and then you can see the tiny little seeds that are in there. When we look at energy value, it'd be highly unlikely you're going to see canola seed. If you did, you would want to grind it, but I put it in here just kind of as a reference so we could see how it compares to soybean meal. But ground canola seed would be about 111 TDN, about 23% protein. You can see 38.7% fatty acids. So really high oil content and canola seed. If we look at solvent extracted canola meal, which would be the majority of what's out there, about 79% TDN, about 41% protein. If you've seen canola meal pellets, that's what we're talking about in this situation. And then there is a mechanical press process, which is a little higher in energy, a little lower in crude protein, just not very much of that product out there. So canola uh, meal pellets would be the most common, 79% protein, 41.5% TDN on average. So I mentioned the name canola versus rapeseed. So rapeseed's actually the species we're talking about, but then through some breeding, we have different types of rapeseed now, and one of those types is what we refer to as canola. Some people call it a variety, but we'll have varieties within that canola group, and so type's probably a little better term. What happened is back in the 1960s, Canadian scientists, through traditional plant breeding techniques, eliminated a couple things or made them very low levels, and those were uric acid and then glucosinolates, which can cause some thyroid issues and some palatability issues as well. And so they bred that out of the rapeseed, and by doing that, then they came up with what they call canola. And that actually comes from the name Canada and oil is how they got to canola. And that's the way most people know it today is just canola. Most of the production is in Canada. There's about 2 million acres of production in the US. The majority of that's going to be in North Dakota. But we do see some production in some other states like Minnesota, Oklahoma, Kansas, a little bit in Texas, Montana, and Idaho. Interestingly, canola oil is actually the second most consumed oil in the US. It's going to be the third most consumed globally. One thing I probably should have mentioned when we were talking about soybeans earlier, soybean oil is sometimes sold as soybean oil, but then also sold as vegetable oil. So if you see vegetable oil in the grocery store, look, most of the time that's going to be straight soybean oil. That canola meal is generally going to be sold as a pellet as well. When we look at sunflower seed, we'll look at some energy values and then we'll look at some more stuff on sunflowers. But when we look at whole sunflower seeds, assuming they've been cracked just a little bit and the hull is still there. They can have some pretty good energy value. Cattle do not like them. They don't eat them real well. Um, about 20% protein, about 37.8% fatty acids. I will tell you at that level of fatty acids, you can actually, on what we call oil seed type sunflowers, you can take the little kernel out of the hull and you can squeeze that between your fingers and oil will come out. That's how much oil is in there. When we talk about sunflower seed meal, there's three different products that are sold out there. There's actually three different manufacturing facilities in the US. And so one of those is sunflower seed meal without any holes. It's going to be about 68% TDM. So on the lower side, about 39% protein. If we look at one of the other processes where we do have some holes left in there with the sunflower seed meal, it's going to drop the TDN about 65, protein about 35 and a half. When we look at sunflower seed meal that still has all the hulls in there, 65% TDN, about 31% protein. The sunflower seed hulls by themselves are not something we ever want to feed because it just doesn't have any energy value and any protein value. That's not ever going to help you in any situations. But when somebody's trying to cheapen up a feed, this is one of the ingredients they'll put in there as a filler to try to cheapen that feed up. And that's why that feed's going to be lower in energy and protein values. So what we would use in this situation is one of these three sunflower seed meals. We don't want to use sunflower seed hulls. It's unlikely we would be using sunflower seeds, just access and then palatability issues. So as I mentioned with the whole sunflower, there's two types. There's what's called an oil seed, and that's what most of the production is these days. And that's what I was describing, where you can actually squeeze it between your fingers and the oil will come out. And then there's what's known as confectionery. That's what we see in human consumption. So if you buy sunflower seeds and eat, that's the confectionery type of sunflower seeds. With sunflower seeds, because that's uh, sunflower seed whole, is really low in digestibility. We really need to crack those. But again, cattle don't like them real well, so you would need to mix them with the more palatable feed stuff. And the sunflower meal, it's generally going to be sold as a pellet as well. Peanuts, peanut meal is not something we typically use in cattle diets because of cost. There's less meal available than other seeds because when we think about what happens to most peanuts, we either eat those peanuts direct or we're going to put them in peanut butter. So it's just a little bit of peanut oil that gets produced is where we're going to get some peanut meal. Peanut hulls, you don't want any part of, 29% TDN. The cows would probably be better off eating the bag that feed comes in than they would be eating those peanut hulls. But again, that's one of those fillers that gets put in a lot of feeds. So you do have to be mindful of that. Some people want to try to use peanut hulls as a roughage source. It's just not a very good roughage source. There's a whole lot better options out there, i.e. the corn stalks we talked about earlier would be a much better option than peanut hulls. Um, and then there can be some rumen health and some liver abscess issues when we're dealing with peanut hulls as well. Peanut skin, so if you think you take the hull off and then you have that peanut, there's that thin membrane around the peanut. That's actually the peanut skin. Again, not something we want to use for cattle feed, although some people try to use it. It's really high in tannin content, which can really tie up some dietary protein, cause you to have to feed a whole lot more protein. We just don't see performance very good when we have peanut skins in a diet. So when it comes to the peanut byproducts, those are typically not anything I routinely ever want to use in cattle supplementation situations. We think about cottonseed, that's one because of where we're located in the southern United States. We have more access and we use a little bit more. When you look at whole cottonseed, unfortunately, there's some wide range of information out there as far as the energy content of whole cottonseed. So I went in here and directly calculated new TDN values for all these feeds using the same methodology and using in vitro measurements for NDF digestibility, and then looking at typical fatty acid digestibility in cattle studies. And when we do that, whole cottonseed just doesn't have near the energy value in there that most people think it does. I won't tell you how high some of the numbers are because I don't want to add confusion, but there's some really high values out there. But just not as much energy because it's 48% NDF, and this NDF is really low in digestibility. So even though there's a decent amount of fat, because this is so low in digestibility, this TDN value is on the lower end there. About 23% protein, so a decent source of protein there. If you're going to use whole cottonseed, you just got to realize it's low in TDN. Make sure you don't feed too much of it because you can get too much fat in the diet, which causes issues with fiber digestibility. Um, there are some places that sell what they call an extruded whole cottonseed meal cube, which the term cottonseed meal is a little misleading in here. Um, but when we look at these extruded cubes, you'll see them with either the linters or delinted, and that's just a little fuzz on the end of the cottonseed there. But if you look at where we kind of figure these energy values because of these TDN, or excuse me, these NDF levels, 55% TDN. That's going to be the same as most average quality Bermuda grass hay. So you're not gaining anything from an energy standpoint. In a lot of situations feeding these, so they're not the great feed stuff that people think. But people get hung up on this fatty acid number and say, "Well, man, look at that fat number." Yeah, but remember what I said. You got to focus on TDN. Don't focus on the fat because we have that fat figured in here, but because it has so much NDF and it's low in digestibility, just don't have a lot of energy. Decent protein, but just not enough energy. Cottonseed meal, about 70% TDN, about 46, 47% protein on a dry matter basis. On a feed tag, it's typically going to be tagged somewhere 39 to 41. This can be a good source of protein supplement, really palatable. One of the places I really like using cottonseed meal is on weaned calves because it's really safe from a rumen acidosis standpoint. It's really palatable and we get some protein in those animals. Cottonseed hulls, low energy value, low protein value, awesome roughage source. So if we're in a situation where we need some roughage and we need a palatable roughage source, that is something we will use. It's not something we're using because it's cost effective from a TDN or a protein source. But there are times where we'll definitely use it because of some other benefits beyond the TDN and the crude protein. Cotton gin byproduct, or some people call this gin trash. Again, low TDN, low protein, not something routinely used. If we need a roughage source in a drought situation, may think about it, but I would rather have corn stalks or soybean, grain sorghum stubble than I would gin byproduct because of some other stuff that's going on there and because of those TDN values. This is just getting into more of that whole extruded cottonseed meal cube. And like it's basically what it is some meal, mostly whole, and some fat that's left afterwards. These are kind of the values you'll see on the tag. But again, look at what that TDN is, 55 and a half, basically. Just not as much TDN in there as what a lot of people assume. So some feeding guidelines with some of our cotton products with whole cotton seed. Sometimes we'll see those animals eat a little bit more than what we'd expect based on the analytical composition. That has to do with the hull being part of that whole cotton seed. I mentioned earlier there are limitations from a fat standpoint. We cannot or we should not feed more than about 5 to 6 pounds of whole cotton seed per cow per day. Otherwise, we get too much fat in the diet. And then if we're dealing with bulls, especially young developing bulls, we have to be mindful of gossypol, no more than 10% of the diet for young bulls, no more than 15 to 20% of the diet of mature bulls. I typically personally would just keep it out of the diet of young bulls just from a safety standpoint, if I was developing a bunch of bulls to sell. If those bulls are in with the cows and they get a little bit of whole cotton seed, when the cows are getting the whole cotton seed, not a big deal there. But not something I want to be feeding to them prior to the breeding season. Cottonseed meal, 5% or less of the diet was for bulls. But again, if you're only feeding those bulls cottonseed meal for 90 days during the breeding season, and they're getting 2 to 3 pounds of a 40% cottonseed meal cube, not worried about that. But I was talking to a producer here a couple weeks ago from New Mexico, where they were out, was in a drought situation. And they were using some cottonseed meal, great on the cows. I don't want to be feeding that long term to the bulls going into the breeding season. Um, Chances are not going to have a problem, but never know when you're going to, because that gossypol will reduce fertility. So just not worth taking a chance prior to the breeding season. During the breeding season, just not worried about it. Cottonseed hulls, I mentioned, are really palatable and they're a great roughage source. They are extremely expensive. So we only use them in certain situations, and cattle will typically eat way more than what you would expect based on their analytical composition there. I mentioned the term 40% cube. That's just a generic term. When we look at those cubes, they'll typically be tagged as 38 to 41% protein. And basically, that is just straight cottonseed meal that they put in a cube. Sometimes it's 100% straight cottonseed meal. Sometimes it's cottonseed meal with a little bit of binder in there as well. Just when we kind of look at these oil seeds, I wanted to put them all on the same slide so you can kind of compare them more directly a little bit easier. If you look at soybean meal, 88.5% TDN, it's the highest in the list. Cottonseed meal and sunflower meal would be the two lowest. Again, we're not feeding these from an energy standpoint, but if we're feeding for a protein standpoint and they have more energy, that's going to be advantageous from a cost standpoint. When we look at percent crude protein, soybean meal is the highest, cottonseed meal is next, canola meal is next, sunflower meal without any holes would be next. So historically, cottonseed meal is what we've used the majority for our protein supplement. But like I said, soybean meal has been pricing in much better per unit of protein the last couple of years. And if it prices in better from protein, we get an added advantage from that extra TDN there. If you look at from a TDN standpoint on the whole seeds, and typically we don't feed any whole seed except for a little bit of whole cotton seed. But just to kind of show you, whole cotton seed actually has the lowest energy value of any of those there, with the exception of whole soybeans, which remember soybeans are a legume, which is one of the reasons they're a little higher in protein here. Most of the other oil seeds are going to be in that 20 to 23% neighborhood from a protein standpoint. So hopefully that gives you a little better idea of where we get some of our feed ingredients, whether we're feeding these individually or whether they're getting mixed into a pellet, a cube, or some kind of textured feed you're buying. It's a good chance it's containing some of those, and hopefully you have a little better understanding of the benefits of those and some we want to avoid. And so with that, happy to take any questions about tonight's presentation or any other beef cattle related questions. And if there's questions about a feed ingredient that I didn't cover, please feel free to ask about those as well. So energy comparison between corn and DDGs. So when we look at whole corn versus DDG, not a huge difference in energy. So I'll go back. That's going to be one of my first slides here. So if we look at whole corn, typically just a little under 91% TDN, DDGs 87 to 89% TDN. Now, typically when we're feeding DDGs, we're feeding it as a combination energy and protein supplement. So if I need both energy and protein, DDGs is a great option for me. If I only need energy, that's where my corn is going to come in. And feeding whole shell corn is a great energy option. I'll tell you, that's something we've used in our family operation for many years, is just straight whole shell corn. And if you want to, you can actually take wholesale corn, feed it, and then top dress a little soybean meal or cottonseed meal on top of it if you need a little bit of protein. So hopefully that answers the question about that energy comparison there. If not, chat back in and we can visit some more about energy comparisons between corn and DDG. Okay, so a question came in, what about mixing loose mineral with your protein and energy supplements? That's typically not something I'm going to want to do. I want to feed the loose mineral by itself, and then I'm going to feed the protein and energy supplements separate. It just makes it a whole lot easier to adjust amounts. The problem if you take the loose mineral and mix it in there, then if you try to change the amount you're feeding of that supplement mix, we can get those mineral levels out of line pretty quick. And so I'd prefer to have the loose mineral fed by itself and then feed the supplement by itself. If that doesn't answer that question again, feel free to unmute or chat back in. On those hay tests, Dairy One, Forage Lab in New York is where I send those. If you want paperwork for that lab, shoot me a text or an email, and I'll be happy. What I'll do is I'll send you a form that has directions on it, and a blank form, and you can use that to fill it out. So do thank everybody for joining tonight, and hope you have a good evening.